Welcome back to Key Safety Talks, everyone. Today we're going undercover
Ooh, undercover.
to explore the world of industrial hygiene air sampling.
Yeah, it's like stepping into a detective novel where the clues are invisible
Invisible.
and the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about protecting workers from hazards they can't even see or smell.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. You're a certified industrial hygienist, the Sherlock Holmes of workplace safety.
I like that, Sherlock Holmes.
What's the first thing on your mind?
Even before I set foot in the workplace, I'm thinking about potential hazards, what materials are being used, what processes are involved.
Thinking ahead.
This is the anticipation phase where we study the blueprint before entering the crime scene.
Right, because even seemingly safe workplaces can harbor hidden dangers. We're talking about gases, vapors, dusts, fumes, mists, all these tiny particles floating around that can cause major health problems if inhaled.
And you know, the scary part is that new technologies and materials are constantly emerging, which means new unforeseen hazards could be lurking just around the corner.
Oh, like what?
Take nanomaterials, for example. They hold enormous potential, but we're still learning about their long-term health effects.
So how do we stay ahead of the curve? It's like trying to solve a mystery before it even happens.
That's where the real detective work comes in. Once we've anticipated potential issues, we move into the recognition phase. It's about walking through the workplace, carefully observing processes and materials, looking for any signs of trouble.
So you're saying it's not just about identifying the obvious hazards, like a giant vat of chemicals with a skull and crossbones on it,
Right.
but also about spotting those subtle clues that something might be amiss.
Exactly. It might be a faint odor, a worker coughing excessively, or even a pattern of illness among employees. These are all red flags that warrant further investigation.
Okay. So we've anticipated potential hazards and started gathering clues. What's the next step in our investigation?
Well, now we need to gather hard evidence, and that's where evaluation comes in. We move from qualitative observation to quantitative measurement. We're talking about air sampling, using specialized equipment to collect and analyze air samples to determine the actual levels of contaminants present.
So this is where we break out the high-tech gadgets and get some hard data, right? It's like dusting for fingerprints or analyzing DNA evidence in a crime lab.
You got it. We have different types of air sampling pumps and media depending on what we're trying to measure. For example, we might use a personal sampling pump to monitor an individual worker's exposure throughout the day.
Interesting.
It's like attaching a tiny detective to their shoulder, collecting evidence about what they're breathing.
And then those samples are sent to a lab for analysis. That's where AIHA accreditation comes in, right?
Exactly. The American Industrial Hygiene Association sets strict standards for labs to ensure accurate and reliable results. Think of it as ensuring the evidence is admissible in court.
Speaking of evidence, we can't forget about chain of custody. That's like carefully bagging and tagging evidence at a crime scene to prevent tampering, right?
Precisely. We need to maintain a clear and unbroken record of who handled the samples and when, from the moment they're collected to the time they're analyzed. This ensures the integrity of the data and helps us build a strong case.
Okay, so we've anticipated, recognized, and evaluated. What's the final act in our industrial hygiene detective story?
The climax, of course, that's where control comes in. Once we have the evidence, we need to take action to protect workers.
So how do we solve the case and mitigate the risks? Do we call in the SWAT team?
Not quite, but we do have a few tools at our disposal. Engineering controls like improving ventilation systems are often the most effective. Administrative control, such as changing work procedures or rotating workers, can also help reduce exposure.
And then there's personal protective equipment, or PPE, as a last resort.
Right. Respirators and gloves can provide an additional layer of protection, but ideally we want to control the hazard at the source, not rely solely on PPE. Think of it this way. You wouldn't just give a detective a bulletproof vest and send them into a dangerous situation without addressing the root cause of the crime.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So we've got our four-step process: anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control. But before we move on, I'm curious about something. You mentioned that exceeding certain exposure limits like the PEL can get a company in hot water with OSHA.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does PEL stand for, and why is it so important?
PEO stands for Permissible Exposure Limit.
Okay.
It's the maximum amount of a specific contaminant that a worker can be exposed to over an 8-hour workday without experiencing adverse health effects. These limits are set by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they're legally enforceable.
So if a company exceeds those limits, they could face hefty fines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But more importantly, exceeding the PEL means workers are at a higher risk of developing occupational illnesses.
That's a sobering reminder that we're not just talking about numbers here, we're talking about people's lives.
Exactly. And that's why getting those air sampling results right and understanding what they mean is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for understanding the importance of industrial hygiene air sampling. Now let's dive deeper into those air sampling methods and really unpack how they work. What are the different types of air sampling and when would you use one over another?
That's a great question, and one we'll tackle head on right after
After.
a quick break. Stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
Welcome back to Key Safety Talks. Before we went to break, you asked a great question about the different types of air sampling methods and when we'd use one over another.
Yes, I'm really curious to learn more about the arsenal of tools at our disposal for gathering evidence. It's like choosing the right magnifying glass for the job, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it. Each method has its own strengths and weaknesses, so selecting the right one is crucial for getting accurate results. Let's start with grab sampling.
Okay, so what is grab sampling and when would we use it? Grab sampling is like taking a snapshot of the air quality at a specific moment in time. It's quick and relatively inexpensive, making it useful for screening purposes or for investigating sudden releases of contaminants.
I see.
Imagine there's a chemical spill. Grab sampling would allow us to quickly assess the immediate hazard.
So it's like a quick reconnaissance mission to see if there's a problem that needs further investigation.
Exactly. Now, if we want to assess an individual worker's exposure over an extended period, say an 8-hour workday, we'd turn to personal sampling. Remember those tiny detectives I mentioned earlier?
Yes, the ones riding along with the worker collecting clues about their exposure.
That's right. Personal sampling pumps are small and lightweight, so workers can wear them throughout the day without much disruption to their tasks. This method gives us a more comprehensive picture of their exposure over time.
So it's like having a constant surveillance system monitoring the worker's breathing zone, ensuring they're not exposed to harmful levels of contaminants throughout the day.
Precisely. Now, what if we want to get a broader picture of the air quality in a specific area of the workplace, like near a certain piece of equipment or in a particular room?
Hmm, that sounds like we need a different approach.
We would. That's where area sampling comes in. We might use a high-volume pump to collect a larger volume of air from the area of interest. This helps us determine if there are any general air quality issues that need to be addressed.
So it's like casting a wider net to catch any potential contaminants lurking in a particular zone. It's fascinating how each method serves a distinct purpose. Now, what about integrated sampling? I'm not familiar with that one.
Integrated sampling is used to collect an average concentration of a contaminant over a specific period, which could be hours, days, or even weeks. We use this method when we're interested in the long-term exposure potential rather than short-term fluctuations.
Okay, I see. It's like tracking the stock market over a year instead of getting caught up in the daily ups and downs. You get a better sense of the overall trend.
That's a great analogy. Now, you might be wondering what happens to those air samples once they're collected. It's time to follow those samples to the lab and see how the evidence is analyzed.
Yes. Let's head to the lab and get a glimpse into the forensic side of industrial hygiene. What kind of analysis takes place in those labs?
Well, it depends on the type of contaminant and the sampling media used. For example, if we're analyzing a filter collected with a personal sampling pump, it might be weighed to determine the mass of particulate matter collected. Or it might be analyzed using sophisticated instruments like gas chromatographs or mass spectrometers to identify and quantify specific chemicals.
Those instruments sound like something out of a sci-fi movie. How do they work?
They're pretty amazing. Gas chromatography separates different chemicals in a sample based on their physical and chemical properties. Think of it like a race, where each chemical has a different speed and finishes at a different time. This allows us to identify and measure the individual components of a complex mixture.
Wow, that's impressive. It's like taking apart a puzzle and identifying each piece. What about mass spectrometry? What does that tell us?
Mass spectrometry helps us determine the mass and charge of individual molecules in a sample. This allows us to identify and quantify specific chemicals with even greater accuracy. It's like taking a fingerprint of each chemical and matching it to a database of known compounds.
So it's all about identifying the suspects and determining their level of involvement in the case. But with all this data coming from different methods and instruments, it must be a challenge to manage and make sense of it all.
You're right. That's where industrial hygiene software comes into play. We use these programs to track samples, manage lab results, generate reports, and analyze trends. Think of it as our crime database, helping us connect the dots and see the bigger picture.
I can imagine it's a lifesaver for industrial hygienists, especially when dealing with complex workplaces and multiple contaminants. What are some of the key features of these software programs?
Well, a good industrial hygiene software program should allow us to easily input data track chain of custody, perform statistical analysis, and generate reports that are clear and easy to understand. Some programs even have features that help us select the appropriate sampling method based on the specific hazards and regulatory requirements.
It sounds like these software programs are becoming indispensable tools for modern industrial hygienists. But with so many options out there, how do you choose the right one for the job?
That's a great question, and one we'll delve into right after we hear from our sponsors. We'll be back in a flash to discuss the ins and outs of selecting the perfect industrial hygiene software solution.
Welcome back to Key Safety Talks, folks. Before the break, we were on the verge of solving the mystery of choosing the right industrial hygiene software. There are so many options available, it feels like we need a guide to navigate this digital landscape.
You're absolutely right. Picking the right software can be overwhelming. It's like trying to find the right detective for a particularly tricky case. It's not a decision to be taken lightly. There are a few key factors to consider.
Okay, let's break it down then. What should industrial hygienists be looking for when they're shopping for software?
First and foremost, budget is always a consideration.
Sure,
These programs can range in price from a few $100s a year to thousands. It's important to find a solution that fits within the organization's means.
that makes sense.
Yeah,
You don't want to break the bank trying to protect the bank, right?
exactly. Beyond cost, the next big factor is the specific needs of the organization.
Okay.
What type of data do they need to track? How many users will need access? What level of reporting and analysis do they require?
It's like tailoring a suit.
Yeah.
You need the software to fit just right. Are there any other features that can make or break a software program?
Absolutely. A user-friendly interface is essential.
Of course.
Industrial hygienists should be able to easily input data, generate reports, and access information without pulling their hair out. You want something intuitive that makes their jobs easier, not more complicated.
That makes perfect sense. No one wants to wrestle with clunky software when they're already dealing with complex hazards. What about data security? That must be a major concern, especially when dealing with sensitive employee health information.
Your spot-on data security is paramount. Industrial hygienists handle confidential medical records and exposure data, so the software needs to have robust security measures in place to protect that information. Look for things like encryption secure login protocols and regular data backups.
It's like having a digital vault to safeguard that sensitive information. So we've talked about budget features, usability, and security. Are there any other factors industrial hygienists should keep in mind?
Yes, a big one is technical support. What happens if something goes wrong or you have a question of the software? You want a company that offers reliable and responsive technical support to help you troubleshoot any issues.
It's like having a lifeline when you're out in the field collecting data, knowing that you can reach out for help if you need it.
Precisely. Now, I know this might sound like a lot to consider, but there are resources available to help industrial hygienists make informed decisions about software. The American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA, offers guidance on selecting and implementing industrial hygiene software, and there are online reviews and forums where professionals can share their experiences and recommendations.
It's like having a community of fellow detectives sharing tips and tricks of the trade. That's fantastic. Now I think it's time to move from the digital realm back to the real world. Can we dive into some real-life case studies where industrial hygiene principles were put into practice? Maybe somewhere things went terribly wrong. I'm eager to see how all this detective work translates into real-world safety outcomes.
I agree. Let's examine a few cases that underscore the importance of getting industrial hygiene, right? For our first case, let's rewind the clock back to 1984 to a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India.
Bhopal. That name sends chills down my spine. Yeah, this is a tragic story, isn't it?
It is one of the worst industrial disasters in history. A leak of methyl isocyanate gas from the plant resulted in the deaths of thousands of people and left hundreds of thousands with long-term health problems.
It's a stark reminder of what can happen when safety protocols fail. What went wrong in Bhopal?
There were multiple failures, including inadequate safety systems, poor maintenance, and a lack of proper training for workers. The incident highlights the catastrophic consequences that can occur when industrial hygiene principles are neglected.
A sobering lesson for us all.
Okay.
Okay, for our next case, let's shift gears and look at a more recent incident. Tell me about the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
This disaster, while not directly related to air sampling, underscores the importance of anticipating, recognizing, and controlling hazards in complex industrial environments.
Yes, The explosion on the oil rig and subsequent spill released millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf, causing widespread environmental damage and economic disruption.
The investigation revealed a series of failures in safety procedures and risk management practices. It highlighted the need for robust safety cultures and rigorous adherence to industrial hygiene principles, especially in high-risk industries.
It's a reminder that complacency can have devastating consequences. Okay, for our final case, let's bring it closer to home. I recall a news story about a group of construction workers who were exposed to asbestos during a renovation project.
Yes, asbestos is a known carcinogen, and exposure can lead to serious lung diseases like mesothelioma. In this case, proper procedures for asbestos abatement weren't followed, putting workers at risk.
What happened? Were they okay?
Thankfully, the workers were able to receive medical monitoring and treatment. However, the incident led to hefty fines for the construction company and highlighted the need for ongoing training and vigilance when it comes to hazardous materials like asbestos.
These case studies really drive home the importance of industrial hygiene. It's not just about following regulations, it's about protecting lives and ensuring that workers can go home safely at the end of the day.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Industrial hygiene is about being proactive, not reactive. It's about anticipating and preventing hazards before they can cause harm.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the basics of the four-step industrial hygiene process all the way to real-life case studies and the complexities of choosing the right software.
It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it? And I hope our listeners have walked away with a deeper understanding of the crucial role industrial hygiene plays in protecting worker health and safety.
I think they have. Remember, folks, knowledge is power. The more we understand about potential hazards and how to mitigate them, the better equipped we are to create a safer and healthier world.
Well said, and thank you for joining us on Key Safety Talks.
Until next time, stay safe.